Hello and welcome to the Bicycle Association podcast, where we aim to share more of the work we do in an easy to digest way. My name is Alex Seaman, I'm the host of the BA podcast, and I'd like you to think of this as BA Bite Size, where we help you find out what's really important for your business and point you to where you can find out more information on our website. In each episode, we will explore a different aspect of the BA's ongoing work to support you, our members. And in this episode, we're going to explore what might be considered the core of the BA's work, advocacy.
You're listening to the BA podcast.
To help me explore what we mean by advocacy, I'm joined here in the studio by Steve Garadis, the BA's Executive Director.
Hi, Alec.
And on the telephone by Phillip Darnton, the BA's Chairman and Principal Ambassador to the Government.
Alec, hello.
Steve, I'm going to launch straight into it. On the website, we talk about advocacy focused on growth. What do we mean by that?
Well, I think it's quite straightforward. The bicycle industry wants to sell more bicycles. And if we have a strategy that grows the market, grows the number of people that start cycling, then we would hopefully sell more bicycles. The happy coincidence is that more people cycling has these huge social benefits, and those range from cutting congestion to improving the nation's health to tackling climate change. So we find ourselves with an industry strategy that's completely aligned with government objectives and social goods.
So how important then is advocacy for the BA's strategy?
It is absolutely front and centre the most important part of what we do. It's our view that government policy is the key to growing cycling because there are some significant barriers to uptake which can only be tackled by changing some really fundamental structural aspects of the way the country currently works, from the number of vehicles on the road to the speed that they drive, to making sure that there is appropriate infrastructure, to making sure that children are trained from the outset and know how to ride a bike. And actually the industry in some ways does the very last bit of that puzzle, which is to provide the machinery of cycling, the bicycles, the kits, the safety equipment, the helmets, the high vis and so on. To allow people to enjoy cycling.
When Steve said fundamental, this is where I think we play a very important role. I'm not sure many people who are listening to this would be very excited about the Environment Act of 2015. But actually, this was the start of everything that we have achieved. Because in the Environment Act, we managed to get a paragraph inserted which said that cycling was to be treated by government in exactly the same way as investment and strategy in roads and on rail. And this was the birth of something which became called the Cycling and Walking Investment Strategy. And that strategy requires the government to do three things. First of all, it requires them to have a strategy. Secondly, it requires them to say how that strategy is going to be funded. And thirdly, and importantly, it also requires the Secretary of State for Transport to report on the progress of that strategy regularly to Parliament. And these are the sorts of things that are really at the foundation of all of the advocacy that we've been able to do since then. Of course, campaigns have a role to play, but they're the tip of an iceberg, which is really deep down in the structure of government and how it works.
I'd like to ask, who exactly do we advocate for?
We take probably the broadest possible view of what the definition of cycling industry is. And that's at least in part because if you want to have some impact and some influence on government, then you really need to be representing the largest possible constituency. The cycling industry is relatively small, turnover around 2 billion a year, which is probably slightly larger than the core of the British steel industry, which we've previously said in the past, are bigger than British Steel. And it's probably similar size to the fishing industry, but certainly not in political weight. So to talk with the largest possible voice is really, really important. And that's why we represent as much of the industry as possible. We represent manufacturers, we represent importers, producers, retailers. We represent businesses that are sort of peripheral to the way that cycling works, from insurance companies to events companies to hire outfits and so on. So it's everybody with an interest in cycling in business.
And I think, Alec, if I may, one of the things that we should get clear quite early on is that industry-wide sense of representation is non-commercial. This is not about making cases for a particular course of action that suits one manufacturer or distributor or retailer. It's about the consensus of the industry as a whole about the things that really will make a difference to the future of cycling, get more people cycling, enjoying their bikes, having fun on their bikes. But it is absolutely essential that our reputation with government rests on being non-commercial.
That non-commercial aspect, does that influence then our standing as a trusted advisor? Is that part of that strategy? Does that tie in there?
Unquestionably, absolutely unquestionably. I mean, there are lots of people who very properly lobby government about their particular interests. And over the years, an example of that would be, for example, cycle to work. Quite proper, absolutely right. That's what people should be doing. However, when government are looking for advice, then they turn to us for that objective, use exactly your phrase, trusted advisor role. They recognize that we are not trying to sell something, promote something of particular interest to a particular group. We are trying to do something for the good of cycling.
With so many groups advocating for cycling, why do we need the BA doing it as well?
In terms of industry advocacy, I think the unique case that the industry can make for cycling that other cycling groups don't make, because there's quite a few very well-known groups operating in the cycling area that have advocated for cycling for many years. Cycling UK, Sustrans, British Cycling a bit more on the sports side. And other organisations that deal with cycling and walking, like the Ramblers and Living Streets. And you've got individual campaign groups in cities, London Cycling Campaign, Cambridge Cycling Campaign, and so on. So what's different about the industry's message on cycling, and can it add something new and unique and get some cut through in a way that perhaps hasn't been possible before? And Philip knows this, worked together since 2005 in various different guises. It's a while ago. I was always sort of quite struck by how little influence the cycling industry really had in the cycling area sort of 10, 15 years ago. And I always used to compare it to the automotive industry, where every case that you'd ever see in the press about motoring was really couched in terms of the contribution to the UK economy, the number of manufacturing plants that there were, the number of jobs that this produced. Nobody ever talked about how nice or good for you it was to drive around, perhaps for obvious reasons, but that was always the message that was coming from cycling. And I think it was quite easily marginalised by previous governments and ministers of yesteryear. And that was really one of the first things we wanted to tackle as an industry advocacy voice, to be a credible voice of business and industry, and really start to position cycling in terms of its contribution to the UK economy, in terms of the jobs that it supports and the value to the economy of the benefits of cycling. And this was quite different, and certainly it was different coming from an industrial position, as opposed to a sort of charitable third sector kind of position. And that was the case that we started with in 2017-18. And we valued the industry at that time at something like 1.6 billion with associated benefits of about 5.4 billion, which happened at the time to coincide with a report that came out about the value of the UK steel industry, which was something like 3 or 4 billion. Of course, we were then able to say that cycling was bigger than steel, which caught some headlines at the time. But really, the purpose of comparing the cycling industry with the steel industry was to position it as one of national strategic importance. And that comes right back to this advocacy message that we were making around COVID and the essential status of the industry. It's essential because it has a nationally strategic important role to play to the UK, to us as a society. And that was the industry message that we wanted to establish by valuing the economic benefits. And it was the message that we pushed when it came to saying retailers and the bike industry should be seen as essential.
I think also, Steve, you mentioned Sustrans and other groups. I think one of the things that as we have created our unique position of representing the industry, we've also very clearly recognized that we are very small. And some of these other organizations that you've mentioned, Sustrans, British Cycling, are huge, and they have huge budgets. And the last thing that we want to do, could afford to do, or should do, is to duplicate or try to imitate things that they are already doing or doing better. But that doesn't mean that we ignore them, quite the reverse. And I think that through a group called the Walking and Cycling Alliance, there are so many of these acronyms, it's appalling, but through the Walking and Cycling Alliance, which is all of those organizations you've mentioned, we do make sure that we, on the really important issues, speak with a common voice. In the past, part of the reason why we got ignored was not only because we didn't have a unique voice, very clearly expressed in the terms you've just said economically, but because whenever government asked a question of 5 organisations, they seemed to get about 15 answers, and were left in a position of saying, well, when you've made up your mind, let us know, and in the meantime, we'll get on doing what we think is right. And so a Walking and Cycling Alliance that brings the organisations together, that ensures that we don't waste effort doing things that other people do or do better, is not to ignore what they're doing. So there's great work going on in Sustrans, for example, on low traffic neighbourhoods, on school streets, on zero emission zones. Great work going on in Cycling UK on the hard to reach communities for cycling. We shouldn't in any sense do anything other than hang on to their coattails, to support them, to put our name to it. Infrastructure, everybody knows very well that safe cycling is something which requires high quality infrastructure. There are organisations up and down the country for whom that is absolutely their total focus. Not, we don't think it's important, it's hugely important, it's top important. But we speak with a common voice and we do the things that are absolutely exclusively ours.
Looking back at the last 18 months, what have been the big wins in terms of advocacy?
In terms of the last 18 months, you can't escape the massive impact of COVID and the extent to which that propelled cycling to the front of people's minds. But that certainly wasn't a given. When we were tracking the oncoming pandemic, January, February 2020, we saw it come to Italy and spread into France. And we saw those countries close all their retailers as they started their lockdowns. And it was with some alarm that we realised that might well happen here in the UK, and immediately sought to make a case to government that cycling retailers ought to be viewed as essential businesses, because we were thinking about how essential workers were going to get to work. We didn't know how bad the pandemic was going to be yet. We didn't know how serious an illness COVID-19 was, how transmissible it was, but we did know that nurses and doctors were going to have to go to hospital, and that other essential workers were going to still have to travel, and they almost certainly weren't going to be able to travel on buses and trains. And so being able to move around by bicycle seemed to us to suddenly be absolutely essential, and therefore the cycling industry, and particularly bike shops, cycling retailers, ought to be viewed as essential. We made that case, and happily we were successful. I think that paved the way for the industry in the UK to benefit from a huge cycling boom. It's always hard to describe benefits of something as serious and awful as COVID-19, but nevertheless, it has seen cycling grow absolutely phenomenally, and to probably add something like $1 billion to the market in the UK in terms of overall value. And I don't think that would have been possible had the Bicycle Association not made those advocacy moves early on.
And I think, Steve, also, you and the team kept that momentum up because we have this amazing quote. It's almost engraved on my heart, because when we got to the fear of the second lockdown, of course, we started all of that momentum, again, to make quite certain that somehow or other people said, well, actually, they did shut down in Europe, perhaps we'd better do the same. And we have engraved this statement from Chris Heaton-Harris, who's the Minister of State for Transport and effectively the most senior operating minister. And he said, I agree that cycle shops provide an essential service. And as in the first lockdown period, I will do my utmost to ensure that they can stay open in the event of any future lockdown. And that's what advocacy delivers.
There are things that the BA does that are not directly identifiable as advocacy, and I'm thinking of things like market data service, sustainability, any of those other workflows that are currently being tackled or handled by the BA. What is the purpose of those if it's not advocacy?
Market data, let's start with that one, because I think in order to have influence with government and to be a trusted advisor, you have to be able to accurately describe what is going on in the industry in an impartial, robust, credible way. And for many years, well, I think decades, the cycling industry in the UK and actually really around the world has operated, I would call it, blind, without any real market data at all. It's quite a nice industry in some ways. You get lots of kind of personal relationships, people doing business on the basis of knowing each other, gut instinct and a handshake. But actually, in the modern world, it becomes increasingly untenable to operate in that way. Particularly the cycling industry is incredibly competitive now. And so having market data is extremely important, not only for commercial reasons, but actually for our advocacy efforts, because we can't go to government without credible data. So the market data service that we set up from scratch, it took us 3 years, is pretty much what underpins almost all the advocacy work that we do in terms of providing us with accurate data that describes what's happening. So if we go in and we want to talk to government about just how important electric bicycles are going to be to get new groups of people cycling, we have to be able to describe what's happening in the electric bike market. We need to know whether there's a growth trend and how many bicycles are sold and what sorts of bicycles and who they're being sold to. So it's incredibly important. Our market data service now captures approximately 70% of the market. We collect data directly from the tills of thousands of bike shops. It's about 2,000 actually, and that's everybody from large retailers to online retailers to small independent bike shops right across the board. So it's highly accurate, credible data that we have to have in order to be able to do this advocacy work. And I think that the second sorts of projects that you were referring to around, I think you mentioned sustainability, and there are other sorts of projects that we do, like, for example, we're currently working on trying to make logistics more competitive for our members. And that's really about trying to engage the broadest possible constituency in the industry. We have to have things that catch people's attention, excite them, interest them, in order to get them to join in our collective advocacy voice. And being able to demonstrate to businesses in the industry from wherever they are that collaborative action can produce results is really important to us. And so we've done projects around sustainability. We've got a project on logistics. We are currently investigating whether we can set up an e-bike battery recovery service nationally. These things are really important in their own right, but also for demonstrating that it's worth coming together and working together, and you can make a difference.
I think the market data service has been a huge boost to the point we were making earlier about trusted advisor objectivity, and the fact that government can turn to us and ask us questions that are hugely relevant to them and to the industry, and be sure that they are getting a fair and proper answer. But there's another, I think, leg to exactly that point, and that's our technical skill, our technical advice. The example that I think is quite outstanding is one that within the cycle industry is probably controversial, and that's e-scooters. Electric scooters are, as probably everybody listening knows, perfectly legal to sell. The problem is, however, that they're not classed by regulation as a vehicle, and so they're illegal to ride on the road, certainly on the pavement, and can only be ridden legally on private land with the owner's permission. Some of our members, therefore, would be pretty keen on them, and I guess there are some members who are a bit sceptical. But the government is now faced with a really difficult problem, which is, should we legalise them, and if so, how? And over the last 2 years, through our technical expertise, we have been advising government, not from a point of view of saying this is a good idea or a bad idea, we're strictly neutral, but from the point of view of saying, if you want to make an electric scooter as safe as it can be on the road, think about things like this, and then set out in a very extensive document all of the things that need to be considered, together with recommendations of what sort of specification that should mean, and comparisons with Europe are very clearly laid out for government to take into consideration as they move forward with this very tricky issue. Nobody else has provided that information. We were invited to make that presentation of our position to the Transport Select Committee at the House of Commons. That's the sort of reputation that we have acquired through our technical expertise, just as Steve has talked about our market data.
We've talked about a lot about what the BA has done over the last 12 months. What's happening? What's the focus for the next 12 months?
What's really interesting is that in many ways the arguments for cycling have been won at a national level, and we've got support and a champion from the Prime Minister downwards. Cycling's never had that kind of support before. So what's stopping us? Are we going to see cycling proliferate everywhere across the land? And the answer is not immediately, and not unless we do something about it, because that national battle that you could argue has been won to an extent, got £2 billion now for cycling, more investment than cycling's ever had. That battle has now moved down to a local level. And actually, we're seeing all the same sorts of arguments that we used to have 10 years ago, but just writ small rather than large at a local level. And I think the Bicycle Association and the industry has the same role to play, actually, at a local level than it did as it did at a national level. We quite often hear when the case is being made at local level for more cycle lanes that you've got to get real, and businesses need to operate and people need to be able to drive to them, and therefore the status quo is the only way to go. And an absolutely fantastic response to that is to have a credible local business industry voice saying that's not true, that cycling has not only got its own economic value in terms of the activity of local bike businesses, cycling businesses, but also the value to the economy of cycling itself has a robust and credible number. So at a national level, it might be 5.4 billion, but perhaps in the West Midlands metropolitan area, it's 1 billion. And that is a really valuable figure to have, and it's a really valuable argument to be able to make to tackle the same issues locally. And so we are working on that. We're working on what we've nicknamed a local industrial case, a local economic case for cycling. And we're using our market data, which we can cut down to regional, local levels, so we know what happens in terms of economic activity from the cycling industry, down to regional and local level. And we can calculate what the economic value is. And we can do that credibly and robustly, and we can work with our members who might be based in those areas. We're going to start with one area to begin with, and then we hope over time to be able to roll it out over more areas.
We're fast approaching the half-hour point, and I was hoping that I could ask you, Philip, if you wouldn't mind summing up some of the things that we've touched upon as we've explored advocacy.
Anybody who's listening to this is going to take away a few key headlines, but to give a sense of the breadth, but at the same time of the coherence of the things that we've talked about. They do all fit together. We've talked quite a bit about e-scooters. We've talked a bit about, very importantly, e-bikes. That sense in which the future is electric. I hope we've covered those. About the future being about children, the future being about climate change, the future being about investment, and the crucial nature of that investment in infrastructure, which government does now recognise and knows that this is the significant block or the significant thing that has to be unlocked somehow or other across the country to make cycling look, feel and be safe. And that people who normally only look at the road through the windscreen of their car and say, I wouldn't like to be on a bicycle on that, actually start to say, no, it really, really is different now. And yeah, I can do that too. So I do think that while we may have touched on things slightly superficially, and if anybody does want, of course, to pursue them in more detail, provide us with evidence, stories. Stories are always terrific. If people can tell us a story, they are so powerful. I think we'd be thrilled to bits to do that. But hopefully what we have managed to do is to just give a sense of both the variety and the consistency, and I hope the determination that we have to make the case for cycling and to go on making that case to make it more and more successful.
Very nice. You're bound to want to use that.
That's a really nice ending.
Beautifully concluded.
Yes. I think then at this point, I'm just going to say, Philip, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and for bearing with us on the phone as well. Really appreciate that.
Not a problem.
And Steve, thank you so much for your time as well today.
It's great to do this in real life.
If anybody does have any questions that have come out of this podcast, then please drop us a line, use the comments box below, or reach out and send us an email, and we will answer your questions as well.
Cue music.
That's all we have time for in this episode of the BA podcast. In the next episode, we'll be talking about bike theft. So if you want to be amongst the first to know when the next podcast is available, click subscribe. But from me, Alex Seaman, and everybody here at the BA team, bye for now.